This is Reynolds Podcast, The Creative Mindset. Hi everyone, welcome to The Creative Mindset, a podcast about what the future holds at the intersection of creativity and technology. I'm Ray Inamoto, the founding partner of IANCO, a global innovation firm based in New York and Tokyo. Is creativity nature or nurture is one of the consistent topics that I come back to time and time and again on this podcast, as well as in my own profession. Having been a designer for over 2 decades and having been a manager in various creative organizations leading teams of creatives and others, how to create an environment that fosters creativity is a topic that interests me deeply. Through trial and error and through close to 2 decades of experience, I've developed my own methods and theories. But have I really studied how to teach creativity? Not really. I met today's guest, Joel Podolny, only recently through a mutual acquaintance of ours. And I have to say, he's one of the most academically and professionally accomplished people that I have ever met. Yet, he's one of the most down-to-earth individuals. After one lunch, which by the way, he paid for, so thank you, Joel, I asked him if he'd be my guest on this podcast. He's gotten an undergraduate degree and PhD from Harvard, taught at Stanford and Harvard Business School, and was the dean at Yale School of Management. He says that he thought he would be an academic for the rest of his life, but one day in 2008, he got a phone call from none other than Steve Jobs. The ask from Steve Jobs was to start a university at Apple and train existing and new employees. For over 12 years, he spent time at Apple as the dean of Apple University, where he led the creation of programs at the world's most valuable company and arguably one of the most creative companies in the world. Since 2021, he ventured into his own startup, Honor Education, which helps universities and corporations with their educational endeavors. There couldn't be a more perfect person to ask about how one can nurture creativity. So let's get started. You were in the academia world for a long time, and then you switched your career into a corporate setting, a little company called Apple, and you were there for a long time as well. And then a few years ago, you started your own company around education. I wanted to start off with, is creativity nurture or nature? And in the context of education, how do you promote creativity?
I think it's definitely nature, it's definitely nurture. If I answered nature, this would be a very short podcast, right? We could just
and it kind of defeats your academic background as well.
right, exactly. And in part, we know that there's a lot that unfortunately you can do in a context to suppress creativity. And, we see a lot of, examples of that oftentimes in our lives. And so I think it obviously follows that there's, of course, a lot you can do if you're intentional about it to create a context that actually elevates and nurtures creativity.
And by the way, the word creativity is one of those words that somebody called it's a suitcase word. In that you can pack a lot of different meanings into it, and there's no one perfect definition for that word. Now, having said that, I think there are 2 layers to creativity. One is similar to what you said about original thought, an ability to come up with an idea or an original thought it's very difficult to say you can come up from nothing to something. Just because these days there's no nothing, right?
Right.
There's always something there. Yeah. But an ability to come up with an original thought or original thing. And then the other layer, I would say, is to the ability to make that happen or to make it.
Yeah, right. There's got to be, that's why I think it's original thought and skillful action, that both of those components need to be there. And so, given that, and then if we shift to the educational context, what we're then thinking about is what type of educational context really elevates original thought, elevates skillful action based on that thought. And I think oftentimes what we're trying to find for those of us who are designing these educational settings for our students is we're trying to find this middle place between a highly prescriptive context where it's about like memorization and imitation on the one hand, because we know that's going to suppress creativity. But we also know on the other hand, what's going to suppress creativity is, what we could call like the terror of the blank page, right? Like if there's too much sort of freedom of possibility, that can be as inhibiting of creativity as can the overprescription. When I started my PhD, I always sort of think back to this moment. When I started my PhD, and that for anybody who goes to get a PhD, that is kind of a moment that is going to require creativity exactly the way we're talking about it. By definition, it has to be an original idea, and then you've got to produce this document on the basis of this original idea. And the first time that I sort of was like, I'm gonna come up with a proposal, I just, and I'm confronted with the terror of the blank page. I was like, I'm just going to go for it. I'm just going to start writing and keep writing. And it was awful. It was just awful what I came up with. Because there was just no structure at all to kind of guide what I was doing. The second time, after I got the feedback from my advisors as to how awful the first one was, the second time I decided I'm going to create the bibliography. I'm going to create all the readings that I want to cite before I even get to the idea. Like, what would be the ideal set of readings that I would love, whatever I produce, to have to cite in order to get to that idea? And at least for me, that created like enough structure and enough anchoring and enough inspiration that it was like possible to proceed without that terror of the blank page. And I would give this advice to my doctoral students from then on, like, don't worry about the idea, worry about the bibliography. If you get a bibliography that you love, the idea will come, right? Like, because you've created that space, the set of associations that your mind can start playing in.
Right. Yeah. So when you were, especially in your academia career, yeah, and when you were, I guess you were in a way teaching because your expertise, your area of expertise was education, right? What would you say was, the key learnings that you had about teaching somebody?
You can think about like a business case. So I taught a lot of cases in business schools. That's an artifact, right? You've got a lot of people who are bringing their own perspectives, their own views, their own background to this common, learning object, and the insights that emerge are from the conversation around that learning artifact. And there obviously are a lot of different kinds of learning artifacts. As I would move from teaching at business schools to teaching at Apple, there would be products that would be learning artifacts. Obviously for those who are in the world of design, this is a very familiar methodology for learning, like sort of design critique. You bring a lot of people around a common work, and you create conversation and different views, and that's what sort of drives the insight and the creative thinking forward. But at least for me, it was sort of a new insight that almost regardless of what you teach, you should be thinking about what do we want to put in front of people as the basis for discussion, whether or not it's an image, whether or not it's a video, whether or not it's an interesting piece of text, whether or not it's a business case. And then it's Socratic conversation around that. It's a lot of questioning. It's a lot of pushing people on their thinking. It's finding the different views in the room and trying to get them to work against one another. That, at least for me, became the way in which I would think about transformational educational experiences, and where we feel we walk out of the room different than when we went in. We have different view, different perspective, different ability, different insight. That's how I would think about it.
Yeah. So just to dig deeper into the idea of having a learning artifact, something tangible, right? Whether it's a piece of text or a thing or something, a piece of music could be, and a conversation around that. Can you think of a scenario, like if you were teaching something, pick a topic that whatever you like, right? And what would be a scenario where, and the types of artifact that you would choose to teach a certain subject matter?
One of the favorite classes that I taught when I was at Apple was a class called Innovation and Amplification, which was essentially around what makes innovations really revolutionary. And I co-taught this class with Greg Christie, who headed up Apple's human interface team for over 15 years. So Mac OS and iOS, that was Greg and his team. And he retired from Apple in 2014, except for this class that he and I would teach together. And in order to get people to really reflect on what makes an innovation really revolutionary rather than just, kind of hype, or, we said, like, let's pick, just great innovations from his. So we'd look at the printing press. We would look at, the Apollo rocket. We would look at radio. We would look at like SX-70, the automobile. And so to take, one of those examples, like the printing press, which I think anybody will regard as one of the most significant innovations in history. In fact, it's kind of the innovation again, so when people are talking about, AI, they're talking about it is it as revolutionary as the printing press, right? So everybody knows this is the benchmark. And yet, if you take a copy of Gutenberg's Bible and you take a page and you compare it to the page of a scribe's Bible at the same time, and you put the two pages right next to each other, it takes a while to even start seeing any difference at all. And so you put this in front of people and you say, this is arguably, as revolutionary an innovation as has occurred in the last 1,000 years. And yet there's hardly a difference at first view between a page from Gutenberg's Bible and a page from the Bible that a scribe wrote at the same time. And then you get people to reflect on, what does this tell us about innovation? What does this tell us about, how we should be evaluating what's important and what's significant in an innovation being truly revolutionary? And that would be one example, because you'll get people sharing different views. You'll get people saying wow, I thought really revolutionary had to be way out there. It had to be this crazy. It's no, it doesn't have to be way out there. It's got to be based on a new set of fundamentals. It's got to drive a new logic. It's got to enable new possibilities. But it may not on the surface originally appear that different from what went before. But until you've got people looking at it and really seeing them side by side, you just don't get that insight.
Interesting. So in that example that you just mentioned, printing press is such a famous example that people can understand quite easily. And the question is, how do you become innovative? How do you create innovation?
And we would teach about Central Park at Apple University. Central Park was motivated by a very big idea, which was that democracies could sustain, great public spaces, because prior to Central Park, there was this view that that democracies could destroy beautiful public places, because if everybody could come in, you just couldn't sort of sustain the number of people. But Vaux and Olmsted, the landscape architects behind Central Park, they believed really strongly, there was like this powerful idea that if you designed it right, you could create this sublime feeling in the senses that would allow for this very peaceful commingling of the classes. But in order to create that feeling, there was more gunpowder used in the creation of Central Park than the Battle of Gettysburg. And it was the largest pumping operation in North America till its time. And among the things that had to be done was the suppression of those roadways, the transverses that cut through Central Park. And if you've gone into Central Park and you've compared the experience of walking through Central, you know exactly that how Central Park creates that feeling. Because you can be 20 feet away from one of those roadways and it doesn't affect your experience of nature. So, I mean, to me, that's like a really, powerful example of one, by the way, an artifact that, we can sort of talk about and reflect on. Two, it's a powerful example of this original, idea of democracy can sustain great public spaces, but now it needs to be skillfully executed. And part of that skillful execution is this massive volume of gunpowder and pumping to create, that particular space. And so that's, that's certainly how we would teach about innovation. And I believe that's how like our students and our conversations would start to unfold, which is, so you've got something you want to make better. You now need to approach it differently. You're going to let the idea be the guide. And now what's the technology? What are the resources? What are the tools that you have at your disposal to start to deliver on that? That's thinking different. Right? That's not being guided by sort of tradition, convention. It's not assuming what has been can be, and so on. Does that example help?
Yeah. Very helpful. Yeah. You were talking a little bit about how you would teach innovation at a corporation like Apple, that where you worked for a long time, but more on an individual level. How do you get, and this may be going back to your teaching days at universities, but say like when you are teaching a group of students, and it's not just about a group of students, but you're also teaching individual students, right? How do you get them to be better, not just better academically, so to speak, but better creatively as individual students? What are things that you encourage them to do to get from point, level A to level X?
At the end of the day, I think probably the most important thing that you can do, and frankly, this would be a classroom or a team, but probably the most important thing you can do to really foster people's creativity is you bring them into contact with others who have different views and are skillful enough in presenting those other views that they can actually change minds. It's one thing for a class or a team to be diverse. It's another thing, it's a higher thing for a class or a team to have diverse views where the members of that class or the members of that team are skillful enough to change one another's minds through some combination of rigorous thought, tact, emotional intelligence. And if you get a team where people are capable of doing that, or a class that as a teacher, you try to foster where people are capable of doing that, that's a powerful experience for the people who are part of it.
In an academic setting versus like a corporate setting, right? I would assume in an academic setting, the dynamic among different people, say the professor or the instructor, and then there are students. And at least among the students, I would assume the hierarchy is less of an issue. Whereas in a corporate setting, I would also assume that the hierarchy is more pronounced. I would say, how can people under the management, how can they do that to present a different perspective?
For the employees, I think there's probably two things, especially if it's in a company with a strong sense of hierarchy, and if it's in a company, I often talk about this as the debate cultures across companies can differ a lot, and one of the ways in which they can differ is what's the threshold, like in terms of the level of execution of the articulation of the new idea, the case that needs to be made. How high does that have to be in order for somebody to propose it? And one of the things about very hierarchical companies is the threshold's really high, right? Like people feel it. Like you better have a lot of evidence. You better have a lot of data. You better have thought this one through if you're going to make that case. So you practice. I mean, you practice, like the first time you have that debate, the first time you make that proposal, the first time you challenge should not be when you're in the room with the senior leader. You should test each other out. Like, I mean, you should get a partner, you should get a group, you should, start working on it, practicing debating, right? There should be no challenge that the senior leader makes that they haven't thought of and worked through and discussed. Because the minute the senior leader comes up with something new, that will be taken as evidence that they haven't thought about it enough, right? So show you've thought this through thoroughly. Again, it's not going to solve all problems, but I think like that. I think that gets you a far way.
Yeah. What I was going to ask was, you switched from academia to a corporate setting at Apple, but hypothetically, and you started your own company a couple of years ago with Honor Ed, but say hypothetically, if you get recruited by another fairly major corporation and perhaps not as successful or quote unquote creative as Apple. And let's say this is a company that's been around for a couple of decades. They were successful. Maybe they are sort of stagnant now. And if your remit was to introduce creative thinking and to ignite innovation, what would be hypothetically the course that you might design for that organization?
So I would try to create a curriculum that was also gave people, again, that opportunity to practice debating, to practice challenging one another. Corporate settings is sometimes you can have people individually who are hugely creative in universities, but they don't work together as much. And so what a corporation can do, what a corporation can be, is it can be guided by a real strong sense of common purpose. And if people find real meaning and passion and connection to that purpose, that becomes the anchor. That becomes that bedrock of constraint on which we can all be creative, because we're always going to go back to that common purpose as the check for, is this idea driving that forward, or is this idea just different? And so maybe that's a roundabout way to come back to your question. I think one of the most important things you'd want in that curriculum is reinforcing that deep sense of common purpose. And then if you can get that, and then you can foster that skill in collective engagement and debate and changing of minds, then you've really created the foundation for that cultural transfer. But I think you need both pieces. I think without the common purpose, then you've got a debate society. You need that common purpose, right?
Debate society, yeah. Okay, so what I took away is purpose, debate, right, or culture of debate, or platform for debate. What will be the next thing?
I think you also want a real reverence for expertise. To me, reverence for expertise is different than hierarchy, right? Like, reverence for expertise is we're trying to give essentially the airtime to individuals based on the degree to which they're capable of, making, a contribution. And over time, people's ability to do that changes. In the beginning, of my career, I can make a contribution within a relatively sort of small area, and I can get better and I can learn and I can get better. And then I can make a contribution on a bigger stage. But I think one of the things that sometimes happens, I don't know if it happens in Japanese companies, it certainly happens in US companies, is you can go too far in thinking that like every individual is equally poised to make, sort of a great contribution. And then what happens is you kind of miss out on those moments of just really, brilliant insight that can only come from experience, expertise, and having been through a lot of, debates and challenges over time. And again, it's a fine balance to walk, right? Like you can go too far in either direction. Does that make sense?
Yeah. This is giving me a lot of thoughts in terms of how I design my own company as well, and how I approach the clients that I work with. That was part one of my conversation with Joel Podolny, the founder and the CEO of Owner Education. In this conversation, he talks very crisply about very abstract concepts. He uses examples, what he calls artifacts, to make his point clearer. But still, the topic that he was talking about was very high level and at times very abstract. And it took me a while to digest and really understand what he was talking about. Usually, when I summarize my conversation with a guest, I try to boil down to 3 takeaways. Instead, today, I decided to boil this conversation down to 3 steps of making a company more creative. The question that I asked him during the conversation was, if you were to be hired by another company that has, say, many years or many decades of a history, but that may be struggling, and your job was to teach that company to be more creative, what's the course that you would design? What are the steps that you would go through? And he gave me, as he was thinking out loud, what came to be fairly crisp steps of teaching creativity. Number 1, common purpose. Number 2, culture of debate. And step 3, reverence for expertise. Common purpose, he used an example of the design of and the build of Central Park as an example or an analogy of how an individual created something that is so big, but also that has lasted many, many, many decades. And I live in New York City, so I get to see the current existence and current incarnation of Central Park. But the purpose that this landscape architect had wasn't so much designing a park, but the challenge of creating a public space where democracy can sustain the public space over time. If it's a public space and it has democratic access to anybody and everybody, it's usually the case that the order and the beauty of that public space, it's very difficult to maintain it. However, his purpose was to create this great public space where democracy can help sustain that over time. The public space itself was just a means to test and prove that democracy can work in that regard. So having a common purpose. And you have heard in this episode as well as the next episode, Joel repeating the phrase common purpose. So that's number one. Step number two is to create a culture of debate. I got a sense that even before he got to Apple, when he taught at multiple universities, among students, he encouraged this culture of debate. He also mentions the difference between diversity for the sake of diversity, having different individuals from different backgrounds, but also diversity of thoughts. It's more important to have diversity of thoughts than just having diversity of people as it stands. Because different thoughts working against each other and pushing each other to challenge and debate, not necessarily argue, but debate to make it better. So creating that culture of debate is step number two. Step number three, what he calls reverence for expertise. What he means by this is having different people play different roles in the context of an organization, having experts to do task A or this role B or another responsibility, having different individuals with different expertise really be accountable and own that expertise, and for other people to have reverence and respect for that expertise. So number one, common purpose. Number two, culture of debate. And step three, reverence for expertise. These three steps, common purpose, culture of debate, reverence for expertise, when you hear these, they might sound quite obvious. But as I was listening to him talk about, hey, how would you create a program in an organization in order to foster creativity, these three steps make a lot of sense, and they might sound somewhat obvious to many of you, but it was the first time that somebody articulated very clearly, such a high abstract concept in a very crisp and clear terms. And I was able to take away these three steps of making a company more creative as something that I could do in my organization as well as clients and organizations that I work with in order to foster and encourage creativity. This was part one of my conversation with Joel Podolny, the founder and the CEO of Honor Education and a very accomplished educator in academia and at Apple. In part two, we go into what he learned at Apple, including specific episodes, what the difference between debating and arguing is, and what makes a company good at what he calls collective creativity. So stay tuned. I am Ray Namoto, and this is The Creative Mindset. See you next time.